read this paragraph and tell me if you think that this is coming from a left-wing critic of Keir Starmer or a right-wing positive framing of Keir Starmer, right? This sentence, this paragraph here, as I wrote on the day of Starmer's growth mission launch back in February, if you didn't know anything about what else of what the Labour Party is, the history of Sir Keir, or composition of the PLP, you'd be forgiven for thinking his speech today was in favour of Trussism. It would be easier to imagine Truss-backing economists switching to Starmer rather than Sunak. Do you think that this is a right winger who supports Keir Starmer, or do you think this is a left winger critiquing Keir Starmer for being too right wing? It's difficult, isn't it? I think the thing that gives it away, is calling him Sir Keir rather than just Starmer or Keith, right? That's really what gives away. But this is from Tom Harwood. Right? This is from Tom Harwood on an article where he talks about Labour flirting with supply side reform, and Rachel Reeves being like the true pro growth chancellor at the moment who believes in supply side reform. Well, I'm glad that there is some unity within the right and the left about the kind of position that Keir Starmer is taking. Obviously, Tom Harwood thinks that it's good. I disagree fundamentally. But the fact that, again, the delusional team sports centrists who know nothing about politics, nothing about ideology, nothing about economics, are the ones saying you have to vote for the red team because they're the good guys. I'm like, he's talking bad guy language, which the bad guys are agreeing with. What the fuck are you going to do now? Well, the thing is, you can have supply side leftist reforms, right? There's a difference between what Starmer and Reeves and Tom Harwood are talking about here with regards to housing specifically. This is referring to housing at the moment, right? In this particular article, this is a whole article about the housing crisis and solutions for it. I potentially was gonna go over it on stream, but I don't think I'll be bothered because it's too much effort. But you can have leftist supply side reform. What do you think building huge, massive amounts of council housing that Jeremy Corbyn was promising in 2019 and 2017? What is that if not supply side reform? But it's not. It's interventionist supply side reform. It is building up state apparatus to increase supply of goods, in this case houses. You're going to have increasing state provision of energy, for example, right? An actual new public energy company rather than a slush fund to throw money at the private sector, which is what Reeves and Starmer are promising. The trickle down, strong business, strong economy stuff that Deletion Quarter in chat is talking about. Where when you look at the GB Energy proposals that I've critiqued on stream a lot of the time, they're just pumping money into the private sector, using the state to turbocharge new green energy, but fundamentally through public-private partnerships, which means giving money to their mates who donate to them, essentially. Whereas you can do the exact same thing with a totally state-owned enterprise. Right? You can have a state-owned enterprise that competes within the sector. Right now we're outside of the EU. There's no fucking competition laws anymore. So you can fuck around with price signals all you like by massively subsidizing the energy sector as far as state provision is concerned to force energy prices down in the private sector, which is what you want out of state control out of these utilities. They'll force private competitors to lower their prices in line with what you're provisioning from the state, just the same you can with council housing. But it's increasing supply. This is fundamentally increasing supply. And that's not what we're getting from Labour. We're getting the opposite. We're just getting reverse PFIs, just private sector subsidy and supply side economics. There's not Trussism, because there's kind of three things that you get. You get the kind of libertarian Truss era economic policy of just cut regulation, cut taxes, you kneecap the union movement, decrease benefits to increase the labour supply, right? All that kind of malarkey. You use that to increase the supply of goods and services, and hope that the money that the additional profits that the private sector generates is paid out more in terms of supply and productivity, rather than just being scuttled off into the pockets of shareholders to increase asset prices. Obviously, that fails. What Starmer and Reeves are promising is a kind of centrist version where you throw subsidy at the private sector in the way that people like Blair would have done, for example, which increases supply sort of with intervention, but none of it's done for the public good, it's done for the private good. Whereas the real supply side reform is Corbynism, social democracy, state provision to be able to increase supply by manufacturing additional supply using state provision. And that is what we as leftists should indeed be supporting. Oh yeah, Tom Harwood was a member of Turning Point UK. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think that if you're a centrist watching this, right? Let me just bring up this fucking Tom Harwood article. It's in my bookmarks. So I think it's really telling about the kind of policy that Starmer and Reeves are actually proposing, and how non-left wing it really and truly is, and how delusional that you look. A, by supporting it in the first place, and B, by thinking that anybody on the left of politics would want to support you. Yeah, and Tom Harwood to the left of Starmer on trans rights as well. Incredible, right? I have a real soft spot for Tom Harwood because I think he's funny, which is bad, obviously. But I do think that from what I've read of his stuff, because I can't try and keep in touch with a lot of people from GB News, he does seem to be genuinely sincere in a lot of the things that he says, in a way that a lot of journalists don't seem to be, which I find quite endearing somewhat, even though I fundamentally disagree with him. And I think he does have principles. I think he's a principled kind of right winger, rather than somebody who uses rhetoric for the sake of political expediency. He just has beliefs that he states a lot of the time. Obviously, his performance as a reporter on GB News is the opposite of that, but his actual writings are interesting. There's a discussion in this article about Help to Buy increasing liquidity in the housing sector, which I also agree with. But the problem is that he thinks that we should have additional. My fundamental disagreement with him is we both agree there should be additional housing supply, but Tom wants the private sector developers to be able to plough through the green belt and to destroy all of our environment for the case of paving over the entire country, which sounds fucking miserable, turning us into just like another American suburb country. Whereas obviously I believe in state top-down construction of high-density housing, like you'd see in Barcelona, for example, the kind of a super block style urban planning from the top down. Obviously, we fundamentally disagree in the ways of doing this, and mine is better because it's destroy the environment. Obviously, land taxes work too. Deletion Quarter's right. I'm absolutely George's and pilled on this kind of stuff. What's really interesting about this article, once you get past his reasonably salient criticisms of Help to Buy outside of additional supply reform in the end, because again, part of his criticism of Help to Buy in this article talks about, well, if you subsidize demand, it'll just increase asset prices, because he makes the assumption, there's an unwritten assumption in this article, that the supply itself is inelastic, which is true. But that's a consequence of the planning things as a policy. You can have Help to Buy. You can have 0% mortgages from building societies. We should have more building societies. We should cooperatize far more of our housing sector. But that's a video for another time. But if you subsidize demand with the ability for developers to increase supply and response, that's fine, really. George is in the belief in the land value tax, Johnny Marco. But supply can respond to additional demand by increasing supply to use the gains of additional liquidity. But again, he doesn't touch on that really. He just takes the inelastic supply as being part of it. And I think there's a world for both of these things to try and get people onto the housing ladder in the first place. Obviously, it does entirely depend on who qualifies in the first place. Hey ho. Yeah, that's the problem, is that YIMBY liberals want the additional housing supply so that they can be landlords, not so that they can decommodify housing. That's why I think the lefty YIMBYs who want to build social housing are the people who have this correct. And also the lefty neither who want to chairman mouth the landlords in Minecraft. But there's a discussion about the Labour Party policy in this article. It's really worth discussing, right? These days, Sir Keir Starmer likes to refer to sticking plaster politics, where a profound problem is merely temporarily covered up in an expensive way. The energy price guarantee that helped send market spiralling in October, which Labour first called for. Now, that's not true. It wasn't the energy price guarantee that sent market spiralling. Market spiraled because people lost confidence in the government after the fiscal event, not after the energy price guarantee was put into place. In fact, the energy price guarantee cooled inflation by ensuring that the input prices of supply were not passed on to consumers as much as they otherwise would have been if people were paying £6,000 a year for their energy bills. Really and truly, the markets were spiraling because of pension funds making irresponsible gambles on volatile securities. Yeah, I wonder if that has any precedent for any other things in the recent past, which made them more vulnerable to other market shocks coming from lack of confidence in the exchequer, which was the result of the stupid policy coming out of the Truss administration not bothering to get some kind of OBR forecast or having their plans scrutinised by the Treasury Select Committee. But there you go. It is a non-sequitur, you're absolutely right, Deletion Quarter. But also, again, the energy price guarantee was proposed by the Liberal Democrats, not by Sir Keir Starmer, and was also proposed with a windfall tax on energy companies, not through deficit spending. So, there's loads of different reasons as to why this sentence is wrong. He described it as an expensive last-minute fix, papering over cracks in our energy security that have been on display for years. A quote which is hard to disagree. Some might say if only Labour had built a single nuclear power station in the 13 years in power, we would not have needed such an expensive intervention. The same, of course, can be said for the Lib Dems and the Tories. And again, this is true. But again, the disagreement I have with Tom about who should provide this, whether it should be the private sector or the public sector. Let me move forward to another discussion that he has around the Labour Party. This is where my head starts spinning. This is where I begin to develop a nagging feeling at the back of my mind. Is the real inheritor of the buccaneering, supply-side reforming, anti-growth coalition slaying Liz Truss inheritance Keir Starmer? As I wrote on the day of Starmer's growth mission launch back in February, the sentence I read out before about him being the one who looked like that he would have Truss backing economists following his economic policy. In some ways, if Keir Starmer were to genuinely to follow through with his party's newfound planning and infrastructure rhetoric, he could lay a greater claim to the Truss inheritance than Sunak has. Rachel Reeves is one of the only politicians who is brave enough to buck modern politics anti-development zeitgeist, using a keynote speech last year to describe cranes going up as a sight we have not seen often enough in our country. Can you imagine a Shire Tory or Lib Dem saying such a thing? The Labour Party slogan has even become "Build a Better Britain." Could today's Labour Party really be more free market on this issue than the Conservatives? And yeah, they are. Crazy, I know. When Keir Starmer was saying we're the real Conservatives, he wasn't fucking lying. He was telling you who he was. And Tom Harwood is right with this. There's a bunch of other stuff in this article which is a bit nonsense, right? How there's a bit here where he tries to say that the reason why we haven't had enough housing building was because of the Town and Country Planning Act of the Attlee administration that ruined things forever. When in the periods between Attlee and by using these stats from the Centre for Cities, another right-wing think tank, saying that there was more building of houses between 1856 and 1939 than there were between 1947 and 2019, failing to account for the fact that the political ideology from 1947 to 1979, when we were building lots of houses, was completely different to the political ideology from 1979 to present day. Like, the idea that somehow it was the Town and Country Planning Act that stopped us building houses and not, Margaret fucking Thatcher that stopped us from building the houses from the 79 period onwards, because she created this whole new class of homeowners who wanted to preserve their asset wealth, which obviously made it less likely to want to build housing to increase the supply, to decrease the asset wealth that they had. The idea that this is the fault of Attlee and not the fault of, right to buy, and Thatcher and Major and Blair and Brown and Cameron and May and Johnson and Sunak and Truss all specifically wanting to try and adhere to the needs of a very small group of Conservative Party voting, asset-rich, home-owning, mortgage-paying boomer types. Saying that somehow Attlee's fault is crazy to me. Again, really specifically pretty deceitful use of data here by the Centre for Cities and then also by proxy Tom Harwood to not blame neoliberalism. Although amusingly, again, trying to say that Liz Truss would be the one that fixed this, when Liz Truss was the one who said that housing targets were Stalinist, right? She was also playing to the asset owner types. In fact, the person who was really looking at the planning reform was Boris Johnson. The planning reform was coming from Robert Colville from CPS, who wrote the Conservative Manifesto, who wanted to have the kind of planning reform that would allow these people to increase so much supply of suburban single-family houses that would pave over the entire fucking country in the way that Tom Harwood clearly wants, right? Again, Boris Johnson and his strategists and his manifesto writers, they knew what was up. They knew how to win these votes over. But clearly, as I said, there's a real actual solution that neither Harwood nor Johnson nor Starmer are going to actually properly propose, and that is new urban development from the state with council housing built in the style of the kind of social housing that you do see in Austria, the kind of new cities that you get, Sotsgrad style urban planning adventures. Look at Barcelona, for example. And yeah, you're right, Deletion Quarter as well, is that so much of Starmer and Reeves' rhetoric around growth is just about increasing GDP. It's the same, trickle-down economics rhetoric about growth that you'd get from Liz Truss, and Tom Howard's right to point that out. And I've made this point 1,000 times. But it's nice to hear that people from the right are also making these same points. And the only delusional idiots who aren't even recognising this are the centrist team sports, liberals who will back Keir Starmer for no reason. So yeah, Starmer is indeed Liz Truss. And it's not just me who thinks that. Right? It's not just the angry leftoids who think that. The people who like Liz Truss's policy want to vote for Keir Starmer to get Truss. That is how right-wing Keir Starmer is in economics. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.